not an obvious journey. I think like all the other speakers, it's been a bit of a zigzag road, although now looking back, it's very easy to see the connections, even if it wasn't particularly planned from the outset. So I'm actually an engineer by training, and then like all good engineers went straight into investment banking, and basically was a financial engineer for sort of 13, 14 years working in the derivatives world, which was fascinating, primarily because it really showed me how the commercial side of the world works, and rightly or wrongly, money drives everything, probably wrongly, but it does. So really understanding how the wheels of commerce and international finance works, and periodically doesn't work. So I went, in my career in banking, I went through a number of crashes and failures of the system, which obviously have an impact and make you sort of take a bit of a step back. The transition began at HSBC, which was my last bank. I ended up being the main contact on the trading floor for what we would today call climate finance. Back then, I didn't really have that title, but it was looking at financing environmental, climate-related transactions. There was a former WWF guy had joined to head up that research piece within the bank. So it was interesting that the bank was beginning to sort of look at these things. And I think perhaps I was one of the few people on the trading floor with a conscience who they'd found to sort of engage with this group and see how we could structure things. So that began to shift my mind in that way. The subprime crisis of 2007, 2008 came along, completely, destroyed the markets and a lot of other things. And that for me was a real signal to change tack. And I found the social impact investment market. The UK was quite a leader in that in the sort of late noughties, early 2010s. And I loved the idea of taking the structuring skills and the finance skills and going to do something more worthwhile with them, where there was a clear output and a clear impact for society in some way, shape or form. And that became for me the stepping stone to setting up Future Fit Foundation. Because I started, again, I'm an engineer, so I started to look at the problem, and to use the analogy, I started to say, why are there so many people in the A&E department? And the A&E department can't cope, it's just flooded with all these people coming in. Why are they coming in? And of course, it doesn't take you very long to sort of realize that actually at the root of all of that is social inequity and inequality, climate change, all of these mega trends. And so the engineer in me wanted to go and try and fix those issues, and that was ultimately why I set up Future Fit, was to try and create tools and a vision of what a truly regenerative society and planet would look like, and start thinking about how do we shift the socio-economic system from the degenerative form it's in today to a regenerative form. So a small task. I think they've got an incredibly important role to play. And when we look at where are the supply chains of the world, I mean, clearly India, South Asia as a whole is an enormous part of this. And I think the opportunity actually is for many of them to sort of leapfrog to a place of being sustainable in the way that they generate their materials and supply everything up. When you think about the sort of the top companies, which will, top of the sort of the pyramid in terms of who you actually are buying things from, typically they're European or American companies, but actually in reality they tend to be sort of branding and design companies, and it's from somewhere down through the supply chains where the real impacts are. Everybody always sort of quotes scope 3 carbon emissions as being multiples, and it is, but it's the same actually across whatever metric you choose to measure. So I think the opportunity for massive impact is for these companies in the supply chain to be able to say, okay, how do we very quickly shift to producing these goods, whatever it might be, in a way that is environmentally and socially sustainable? Now, that's not to say it's easy. It certainly is not. I mean, again, as you've already said, if it was, we would already be doing it. So there is a very complex and difficult conversation to be had about how is that done? How is that supported? Where are the costs going to be encompassed? And we all know that, sadly, doing things in a degenerative manner is far cheaper than doing them in a regenerative manner, in the way that we have things set up today, because we don't price the negative externalities. We don't price climate change. Now, I'm not advocating necessarily that we want to start putting dollar values on anything. That in itself is a slippery slope. But when you look at, we've already talked this evening about some of the devastating impacts that we are seeing on a day-to-day basis now. These aren't one-offs anymore. They're a regular occurrence. But nobody has valued that into the profits that have been made in the past. And the price is now being paid by the people whose houses are being washed away, or who are dying in landslides and mudslides, whatever it might be. So again, there are very, very tricky conversations to be had ahead. But for me, it's got to be about not looking back and blame. It's got to be about looking forward and saying, how do we now rapidly change the way all of these things are done? We know so many of the answers. This is the deeply frustrating thing. It's not like we're waiting for technology to give us lots of answers. Generally speaking, we know what many of the answers are. And if we got on with those, technology could then catch up and fill in the gaps, right? So it's like, how do we begin to drive that shift? And I think the opportunity, particularly for South Asia, is huge and critical. I've often said in the past, if we don't bring America, China, and India with us on the future fit / sustainability journey, forget it, right? I mean, England can do whatever it likes, and it should, but it's tiny. Where are either the biggest economy, although that's having its own problems right now, we won't go into that, or billion plus populations, right, at the bottom of the supply chains? That's where the impact is happening, both in terms of how they can influence the world, but also, again, as we've discussed this evening, how badly they are being affected today by these changes. So it's very, very important. So, I mean, again, it's the target is clear. So how do we build the right relationships to help drive those change, particularly at a time where the type of government cooperation that we need right now doesn't particularly seem to be very forthcoming. I think the ties between India and China are very strong, or seem to be, and seem to be growing, and that's a good thing. But we're seeing a massive divide at the moment between the BRICS and the BRICS, and there's a real sort of shifting of or tussle for world order, which couldn't be more badly timed. We really need to be focusing on the issues that actually matter, like surviving as a species within the next 20 years, which personally I think is quite a motivator. But sadly, many world leaders seem to be more interested in their borders than this. So I think again, it's not straightforward, but at least there does broadly, with one clear exception right now, that the idea of getting to a net zero, or ideally actually zero, net zero is actually in itself a bit dangerous. Zero emission future is where we need to be. I think China is a fascinating dichotomy in so many ways, but when you look at the speed of rollout of clean energy there, has been phenomenal. Now, we also know that it's still spewing out a lot of coal-based power and all the carbon that comes with that. But the indications seem to be actually we've probably passed the peak of that now. When you look at the data, it does look like we're tipping over. So all of these things are positive signs. The idea now with, particularly again in European and should we say Western companies of insetting for carbon and trying to assist with the supply chains actively is another positive step. And then finally, obviously regulation. The European regulations now are very, very stringent, or starting to become so, on imported carbon and things like that. So there's a bit of a carrot and stick element going on within all of this. But I think the opportunities for businesses in South Asia who move quickly on this, it's ultimately going to benefit them, because they are going to be the ones who can position themselves as the more resilient business and the better business to be doing or to be having a partnership with. So, as with any relationship, it's about sort of hands reaching out from both sides, right, and finding those partnerships. And despite the rhetoric that we're seeing at the moment, which obviously has been, generally negative, I think the headlines are negative, but actually what's going on underneath, an awful lot of companies are just, maybe they're not shouting about it so much, they don't want to, be in the spotlight, but actually they're still pushing forward with a lot of both environmental and social issues. Yes, for sure, some are pulling back, but many are still pushing forward. So I think the opportunities are very, very strongly there. Yeah, so my personal faith has been very important to me on this journey, and I think in some ways there is an element of if you have that worldview that goes beyond just the here and now, that automatically opens up questions as to the value not only then of your life but all life. And what are we doing on this journey? Is this just all it is, and the day you drop dead, that's the end of it? Or actually, does what you do echo down through eternity? And are there is it important what you leave behind, what you do with your time here? Is there some greater meaning and greater power, or whatever word you want to use, that guides us on these journeys? And I appreciate not everybody, shares those views, and even within saying faith, you instantly open up a huge realm. But I think what most, if not all, faiths pretty much will agree on. You've spoken a lot about Mother Earth, and I think in the sort of in the Judeo-Christian faith, I think we might not use that exact word, but we absolutely understand what that means. And pretty much all faiths have that concept of stewarding the earth, of looking after each other in community. So these are common values that we can all come around. And with that, gives us that purpose to be driving these types of change. Some of the other speakers have already talked about their own personal journeys as well in this regard. So I think that is an incredibly powerful tool. I mean, just imagine if everybody in the world tomorrow who adheres to a faith were to turn around and say, actually, yes, the world is valuable, not just from a mere fact that we just exist on it. Of course, it should be a bit of a no-brainer, but actually to say we believe that there is a greater power, a greater purpose as to why this planet is here. Our duty is to steward it for the future generations, and that we should live in community with the whole of the planet, and not be treating various groups of people as slaves or subservient to us or whatever, as has often happened in history. What instant change would we drive? I mean, the world would literally take a step better tomorrow, right? There'd still be a lot of things to sort out. So, it starts to ask an interesting question that when, I don't actually know, what is the figure of how many people actually purport to have a faith in the world? But it's certainly the majority. I think if you added sort of, Christianity, Islam, a couple of other of the major faiths together, you've probably got, 6, 7 out of 8 point whatever billion people. Well, all of them, I think, profess in some way, shape or form. But, sadly, as we know, that doesn't lead to action. We don't all agree on whether or not that's the right way forward. But for me, it's an incredibly, if not the most powerful tool. So I think finding the ways to engage with each other respectfully, and try and bring other people on the journey. But I think if you've got that bigger perspective, then I kind of think it's probably easier to draw these elements out and challenge people on an individual level. What are you doing about that? What is your life going to be? I'm delighted that you're not going to be an investment banker and you're not just sat in even worse, an economics research lab. That sounds horrific. But you've probably just offended half the people in the room. No, but you've dedicated yourself to heading out on this journey, and that's absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure many of the people, that's why they're here in this room. So, yeah.